Please return to your seats. We're now having a guest lecture. Let me introduce to you Mr. Hardy-Chartrand. He is a specialist of East Asian studies, and here's his track record so far. He earned his bachelor's degree at the University of Montreal in political science, his master's at the University of Quebec in Montreal in international relations. Then he studied 1 year at Yonsei University in Seoul, South Korea, with a major in political science. Then he came to Japan in 2012 to work at the United Nations University. He's currently an associate researcher at the think tank Hardy-Chartrand Chair of Strategic and Diplomatic Studies. Now, he's going to talk on Japan's rocky regional relations, the consequences of rivalry. The speech will be followed by a question and answer session, so please hold on to your questions until this speech is over. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you for being here. And I want to thank sincerely Nichibei, and specifically Dr. Goy for inviting me today to give this conference. I'm very happy to be here. As Mr. Hashimoto said in his presentation, I came last year to work at United Nations University. I found over the years, well, since last year, that many Japanese people are not familiar or even not aware of United Nations University, what it does in Japan. So the headquarters is here in Tokyo. And the purpose of United Nations University is to contribute to the goals of United Nations through research. So it is basically the research arm of United Nations, contributing to the goals of the UN, such as human welfare, sustainability, human development. So today the purpose of my presentation is basically I feel it's essential to understand the nature of Japan's relations with its neighbors and to understand mostly the consequences of Japan's difficult relations with its neighbors. Now, if an outsider were to look at East Asia, the East Asian region, for the very first time, without any preconceived knowledge, without any preconceived ideas about East Asia, this person would have probably a hard time understanding why it is that Japan has such difficult relations with its neighbors. Let's just look at some hard facts, first of all. Japan has the third largest economy in the world. It has a globalized and integrated market. It has a vibrant democracy and actually is the 8th most populous democracy in the world. And it has renounced war since World War II. These would be normally ingredients for very stable and positive regional and international relations, but it is not the case. But in fact, Japan has developed very good relations outside of Northeast Asia. It enjoys a very positive reputation and image in the world. Now, in May 2013, so that's only 6 months ago, a BBC international poll found that Japan had the 4th most positive image in the world. The first country, by the way, was Germany. But in 2012, so just 1 year ago, Japan was actually number 1. It has the most positive image in the world. So it is obvious that Japan is admired around the world for its culture, for its people, its technology, for the way that it has developed its economy in the 20th century. So why is it that Japan's relation with China, with South Korea and North Korea are so tense and difficult? Why is it that among the 10 most populous nations in the world, why is it that Japan is the only one that has such difficult relations with the majority of its immediate neighbors? So why is there such a disconnect between the way that Japan is viewed here in Northeast Asia and outside of Northeast Asia and the rest of the world? And most importantly, what are the consequences of the rivalry between Japan and its neighbors? So I hope to give some answer to that, or give some ideas for further reflection and thought about these issues. So I'll describe relations, Japan's relations with China, South Korea, and North Korea. And I will look at the impact on the economy, on politics, and on security. And I'll look at what could possibly be done to improve the situation. Now, cooperation in Northeast Asia has always been difficult, mainly for historical reasons. However, Europe, for the first part of the 20th century, was also divided by rivalry and war, but it has been able to overcome the situation. So history is not the only reason that East Asia has remained divided, while Western Europe has mostly thrived as a generally united continent. On the one hand, Europe has quickly moved towards what we call institutional liberalism, which is a view of the world where institutions and international organizations contribute to peace and cooperation. While, on the other hand, looking at East Asia, East Asian states like Japan, China, North Korea, and South Korea have embraced a view of the world that is closer to the realist theory of international relations, which means that they view states as being competitive and as being only concerned with self-interest and survival. So let's look first of all at Japan and China's relations. Japan and China, to a certain extent, are natural rivals. They have fought two wars together. And as the two giants of East Asia, they have a natural tendency to compete for resources, for territory, for prestige. And Japan and China relations have always been difficult, but these past few years, and specifically in these past few months, bilateral tension has been raised to another level. The main point of contention, as you all know, of course, is the dispute regarding the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. You will notice today I will always mention both names, Senkaku Diaoyu. I want to make sure and emphasize that I stay neutral on this point. So the tensions in the East China Sea has been increasing steadily since 2010. 2010, you may remember, a Chinese fishing boat rammed or hit two Japan Coast Guard boats, and after that, the Chinese captain was held by Japan for a little more than 2 weeks. And so since then, the situation has escalated. There have been several Chinese aircrafts that have been flying over or near contested areas. And in response, Japanese fighter jets have been scrambled as well to the area. Recently, we have heard a new revelation that there's a Japanese plan, defense plan, that says that the self-defense forces will intercept and shoot down foreign unmanned aircraft that ignore warnings to leave Japanese contested areas or leave Japanese territory. And there have been increasingly frequent patrols by Chinese boats and by Japanese boats as well. And China's defense ministry has recently lodged a formal complaint because of what it called serious Japanese provocation by Japan during a Chinese military exercise in the area. So China is becoming much more active in the South China Sea, and there are more risks of confrontation because of that. Any kind of confrontation, of course, would deteriorate the bilateral relation even further. Can both countries let that happen? Of course not. Neither Japan nor China wants any type of armed conflicts or even localized conflict at this point. And in these times of uncertainty, neither country can afford to get involved in a conflict. The problem now is that there is no end in sight to this dispute. The Japanese government is not willing to admit that there is even a dispute. And the Abe administration is determined that Japan stand up to any China action. And on the other side, it is the same thing. China will not back down. In 2009 and 2010, some Chinese officials have started talking about the island disputes as Chinese sovereign core interest. Now, the expression core interest is usually used regarding Taiwan, for example, Tibet. That means vital issues regarding which China will not compromise in any way. So you understand that in the near future or midterm future, there is no end in sight to this dispute. There's no compromise to come, I believe. We have to understand that in China, the legitimacy of the Communist Party is closely linked to its perceived role as a defender of national interests, ever since they fought a war with Japan. So if China backs down, if China decides to compromise, there will be an enormous backlash against the Communist Party, and that will result in a loss of legitimacy, a loss of authority. Both Japan and China are sensitive to the situation, but they don't seem to be ready to take the necessary steps to repair or to improve the bilateral relations. What are the consequences of the current tensions? There have been reports that in 2010, after the fishing boat incident, it hasn't been confirmed by China, but there were reports that China blocked rare earth exports to Japan. Now, rare earths are extremely important for Japan because they are necessary components of high-tech products that are built here, for example, smartphones or computers. Japanese companies in China have been badly hurt by the tensions. Trade has decreased, and Japanese businesses are increasingly talking about the so-called China risk regarding doing business in China. In 2012, Japan's export to China decreased by 10.4%, and Japan's total trade with China decreased by close to 4%, which was the first decrease in 4 years, since 2009. Several high-level meetings have also been canceled. Ambassador Niwa, who was the Japanese ambassador to China, was supposed to help hold several high-level meetings, economic discussions in many Chinese cities in 2012. All of these meetings were canceled, specifically because of tension regarding the island dispute. Xi Jinping, the new president of China, and Prime Minister Abe still have not met, although they have been in power for close to a year now. Meanwhile, one of the most important aspects is the populations of China and Japan have never been more hostile to each other. I will encourage you to please have a look at the first chart, which is in the document that you should have. The very first chart. This is the impression of Chinese and Japanese impressions regarding the other country. So it is very revealing. 90.1% of Japanese have a negative opinion of China, and 92.8% of Chinese have a negative opinion of Japan. That is the worst result in the past 9 years of studies. So this negative opinion from the Chinese was reflected in anti-Japan protests last year in several Chinese cities. And these protests did a lot of damage to Japanese interests. And these protests were actually supported or condoned by the Chinese government. And so the mutual dislike that we see right now has huge consequences on relations and also puts pressure on both governments. Now, despite its shortcomings and despite economic uncertainty in China, China will continue to grow more powerful economically, politically, and militarily. So can Japan really afford to have such bad relations with the rising global power, with its giant neighbor? Of course, the answer is a resounding no. I will talk about possible potential solutions to that later, but I want to move on to Japan and South Korea relations. Now, whereas China and Japan could be considered natural rivals, on the other hand, Japan and South Korea could be considered natural allies. We are talking here about two democracies, two market-driven economies, countries that are dealing with very similar security issues, namely North Korea, and two countries that count the United States as their number one ally. But because, again, of different interpretations of history, mostly the issue of comfort women and the Takeshima and Dokdo Island dispute, instead of being allies, Japan and South Korea find themselves unable to trust each other and unable to cooperate politically, unable to build closer political ties. Now, so far, South Korea has ignored Japan's requests or Japan's advances for high-level meetings, and they have stuck to a line that says that Japan must do more to address historical complaints, historical issues. We have to understand that in South Korea, it is very beneficial for politicians to have a hard line against Japan. It creates benefits for the administration, and it's an easy way to get support from the population, which explains the attitude from South Korean administrations. But interestingly, both admit that the bilateral relations between South Korea and Japan is very important for their security. But somehow it has not led to better ties. None are ready to do what it takes to be more sensitive to the other's point of view. Now, the consequences of the tension between Korea and Japan. Well, there have been no leader meetings since May 2012. Now, both Prime Minister Abe and President Park have been in power for almost a year. They were elected almost at the same time, but still have not met, despite the importance of bilateral ties. And that is a very significant and unfortunate development. In 2012, because of the dispute regarding Takeshima and Dokdo Island, the chief South Korean negotiator on the free trade agreement between South Korea and Japan admitted that because of the island tensions, because of the bilateral tensions, it was difficult to make progress in the talks for the free trade agreement. And there were also canceled deals and political agreements. After Kim Jong-il died in North Korea in December 2011, South Korea and Japan decided to negotiate on military agreement, information sharing agreement. So they actually concluded an agreement which would have made it easier to share military sensitive intelligence and to share military strategy. That would have been great to deal better and more cooperatively regarding North Korea. And the United States was very supportive of that deal also. That was last year. But the reaction of the population and opposition party was so negative, there was such a backlash, that the South Korean government was forced to cancel the deal. So 1 hour before South Korea and Japan were scheduled to actually sign the document and agreement, 1 hour before, South Korean side called the Japanese government and said that the deal was off. And that is mainly, in great part, due to the bad feelings regarding Japan and the historical issues of colonization and comfort women. Now, more than 60% of South Koreans view Japan as a military threat in the region. That is according to Asan Institute in South Korea, a very respected institute. A 2013 BBC World Service poll found that 19% of Japanese view South Korea's influence negatively. 21% of South Koreans view Japanese influence positively, and 78% of South Korean view Japanese influence negatively. These are staggering numbers. 71% of Koreans see relations between Japan and Korea as competitive. Only 21% view them as cooperative. Now, would you please have a look at the second chart, which is favorability of leaders. Should be the second chart on your in your documents. Now, it asks South Korean people to rate how they viewed, how favorable they were towards a regional leader. Obviously, the most favored leader is Park Geun-hye, the female president, so 64% favorable. Now, look at the other end of the chart. The lowest, least respected leader was Kim Jong-un, so 11%. Now, think about it. Kim Jong-un is a leader, dictator of one of the most repressive countries in the world, one of the worst dictatorships in the world. And Prime Minister Abe has barely 5% respect, deserves only a little bit more respect, barely more respect than Kim Jong-un. I think that's a very sad state of affairs, and it's very revealing regarding the relations and the perceptions of South Koreans. If we look at the next chart regarding country favorability, the next chart now looks at how South Koreans view different countries in the region. If we look at China and the US, the perceptions are rather stable, as you can see, since 2010. North Korea has decreased a bit, but Japan has decreased quite a bit since 2010. It went from 42% favorability to 26%. Now, what I see is that there has been a sharp decline in only 3 years, but that also means that there is potential for returning to previous levels of support if the right moves are made by the leaders. Now, it's interesting because actually 58% of South Koreans support a potential summit between President Park and Prime Minister Abe. But now, at this point, the tense relationships between Japan and South Korea has had negative impacts for Japan, for South Korea, and for the United States, especially when it comes to containing China and North Korea. So let's move to North Korean relations with Japan. Now, of course, it's not surprising that Japan has bad relations with North Korea. North Korea has negative or bad relations with pretty much every country in the world, including China. So, but North Korea sees Japan as its second biggest enemy, to a certain extent, almost as on par with the United States. North Korean media constantly talks about the threat of Japan, always says that Japan is building its military power, and always says that Japan wants to invade North Korea again. Of course, this is mostly internal propaganda, but it demonstrates how North Korea views Japan. Mostly the consequences of this tension with North Korea are on the security side, in the security field. Of course, we have to understand that North Korea has no interest in attacking directly, in provoking an attack on Japan, because it would result in retaliation, and it would result in the guaranteed death of the Kim Jong-un regime. But North Korea's ballistic missile program still poses a great threat to Japan. In 1998, North Korea conducted a missile test, and you may remember it flew right over Japanese territory, and that created a very big uproar here in Japan. It was a very major security threat. And Japan is always close to North Korea's firing lanes when it comes to missile tests, always coming very near Japanese territory. So as long as there is a missile program in North Korea, it will remain a security threat for Japan. Plus, let's remember this, although North Korea will not provoke an attack directly on Japan, there is always the risk that if North Korea is on the verge of collapsing, if there is a conflict, for example, with South Korea, with its back on the walls, we never know. North Korea has always the capabilities and the possibility of firing artillery and long-range missiles, not only to South Korea, but also Japan. So, because it could retaliate, it remains a security issue. And we cannot talk about the North Korean and Japan relations without briefly mentioning the kidnappings issue. So the 1970s and 80s, several Japanese residents were kidnapped by North Korean spies, and it remains the main bone of contention between North Korea and Japan. And when, for example, when there were the six-party talks on denuclearization of North Korea, although it's a totally unrelated subject, kidnappings issue often came up and became stumbling blocks in the relations. So most countries were hoping that Japan would not bring it up, but it still did. And so it has consequences even on the denuclearization talks, which have not been going on for the last 4 years. Now, in conclusion, so the consequences of the regional rivalry and tense relations are numerous and have impacts on the economic, the political, and military situations. In case of the economy, I have mentioned it earlier, but it has resulted in decreased trade, especially with China, in economic opportunities missed, and the cancellation of agreements, as I have mentioned, regarding the military sharing deal. And it has resulted as well as in an increase of military spending. And many people are fearing an arms race at this point in Northeast Asia. Politically, the fact that Japan is viewed in such a negative light by its immediate neighbors, it affects its political authority on the world stage. If Japan spoke in a united voice with South Korea, its voice would be stronger. For many years, Japan also lobbied for an extended Security Council so that it would be included on a reformed Security Council. But China, as a veto power, as one of the 5 members of the Security Council, has said repeatedly that it would always veto Japan's request as long as it feels that Japan has not addressed the historical issue regarding the so-called aggression of China. So because of this issue, it prevents Japan from gaining the voice that it deserves, or that it feels that it deserves. There have been a deficit as well of cooperation. I mentioned it earlier, but in order to have a good, sound policy regarding North Korea, all countries in the region need to cooperate. The lack of deficit affects nuclear proliferation or anti-nuclear proliferation. It affects cooperative work as well on terrorism, on intelligence sharing, and to a certain extent even potentially on climate change issues. Now, in case of a military situation, if the tension was lower, if China was not perceived as a threat, it would be harder for Japan to justify a rising defense budget, especially in times of economic stagnation. Despite the difficult economic situation, the Japanese self-defense forces keep expanding, and last year there was the first defense budget increase in 11 years. There has been also the inauguration of a new giant destroyer, the Izumo, which pretty much looks like an aircraft carrier, and that created it made Chinese very uneasy regarding that development because it was right in the middle of the tensions, and that was obviously a message to China. So the Abe administration in Japan should be more sensitive to the concerns of its neighbors, but of course Japan is not the only player responsible for improving relations. All states have a part to play to resolve the current situation. China's leaders would need, first of all, to curb anti-Japanese sentiment in the population. They need to stop appealing to nationalist urge in the population. And they need as well to accept the Maritime Code of Conduct. So many countries are pushing for that code of conduct that would regulate activities in the South China Sea, among others. But China is against that code of conduct. Now, in terms of when it comes to South Korean leaders, they need, of course, first step would be a bilateral meeting between President Park and Prime Minister Abe. They need to sign, of course, as quickly as possible the military intelligence sharing agreement, which was canceled last year. But there has been no development since it was canceled last year. They need to make clear also what needs to be done to put an end to the historical issues in terms of apologies and compensation. Because we have the feeling, and I'm sure a lot of people here have the feeling that no matter what Japan does, there will always be grievances, and they will always keep asking for more. So in order for that situation to be resolved, Japan needs to know exactly on South Korea's part what needs to be done. U.S., of course, has a very large role to play, especially when it comes to South Korean-Japan relations. Right now, United States is not playing a very large role in this dangerous affair. It should help, as an ally of both South Korea and Japan, help a convening summit between the leaders. That would be one important step. But the main thing here is that no matter what the US, what China, North Korea, and South Korea do, Japanese leaders must understand that without cooperating more closely with China and with South Korea, it will be impossible. It will be very hard for Japan to completely put behind the economic slowdown. It will not be able to play the role that it wants to play, not only in the region, but on the international stage. So let's just hope that the next few years will bring about some more enlightened leadership everywhere in the region. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Benoit. Because of some time considerations, we'll take one question here, and those of you who have additional questions, you can come forward afterwards, and it's not going to go away. So, anybody with a question, please raise your hand. Okay, go ahead.
I teach some Chinese students and Korean students, and it's interesting that you said that, well, this is a controversial issue, and but my students tell me, believe me, Ms. Asami, well, my friends told me not to come to Japan because I'll be hated in Japan. But that was not true. I'm glad I'm here. However, my students will often say, once I return to China, Korea, then they will criticize me having gone to Japan and becoming an ambassador of Japanese. But what can we do? It's like a marriage. Well, we cannot be the same, but see, we should be united. And the issue of Japan, being part of, we are like brother, or maybe, I've always thought China being mother or grandparent country to Japan, like kanji characters came to Japan, the 12 Chinese zodiacs, and lots of things. But maybe if I speak a lot of that, then I could be an outsider within Japan. But in Europe, they've had pretty good, interesting issues against each other within the country. But they now are united as European Union. Could that happen in East Asian region, in your point of view, within 50 years?
Well, there are...
No, you don't have to match up for time, right?
There are several questions in there, but I would just want to address the first thing you said, which I think was interesting regarding your students, because one thing we notice is every time we have students coming from abroad here, especially South Koreans and Chinese, as you mentioned, they realize very quickly that they are, for the most part, very welcome here, that they are not the subject of hatred, personal hatred from Japanese. One thing that would certainly help is to encourage further contacts between, especially the younger generation. I've noticed myself, having spent a lot of time in South Korea, how much resentment there is in South Korea regarding Japan. And one thing that helps is these kinds of contacts. So there should be more funding, perhaps, for intercultural meetings, contacts, study abroad programs, cultural programs, all kinds of things. When it comes to the European Union issue, I don't believe in our lifetime we will see any kind of integration as we have seen in Europe, unfortunately. Europe has dealt very differently with its past compared to Japan. I'm not a specialist of European history, but from what I understand is Germany, for example, and France, right after the war, there were commissions that were meant to repair relations. The trials have perhaps been more effective as well in Europe. There has been as well more feelings of contrition and regret expressed and sincere regrets that were expressed in European on the part of, for example, German leaders. We all remember the German chancellor who kneeled in Poland to apologize for what happened. This kind of thing, we haven't seen that so far in Japan. For these reasons, it's unfortunate, but there is too much rivalry, there is too much nationalism. Like, while this level of nationalism is prevalent in East Asia, we will not see that. I think the first key is to decrease this kind of ethnic and opposition-based nationalism. So that's what we can hope for.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for your inspiring and informative words.
Thank you very much.
Taking a 5-minute break before the closing ceremony. And those of you who have additional questions, we know it's here, so please come forward.